Jake Claver just made a crazy statement, and most people have no idea what it actually implies for XRP. He said, "We're there, not soon, not someday, we're there. Not next year, not after another cycle, now." And here's the uncomfortable part. If you think this is just another hype comment about a green candle, you're already missing the plot. Because this moment isn't about XRP pumping. It's about something underneath the surface finally breaking. Let that sink in. Most retail hears Japan rate hike and thinks macro noise. Smart money hears it and thinks carry trade unwind. And those two interpretations lead to very different outcomes. This isn't a story about a single central bank decision. It's about decades of cheap money, leverage stacked on leverage, and a global financial system that only works as long as liquidity stays easy. And when that assumption breaks, everything reprices at once. We'll come back to why that matters for XRP specifically, because this is where most people get it completely wrong. Welcome back to Lion of Crypto, where we connect the dots between macro pressure, institutional behavior, and the plumbing of the financial system, not the emotional noise dominating crypto Twitter. If you're still here, it tells me something. You're not here for dopamine candles. You're here to understand positioning. Now let's validate the hook, because Jake's statement wasn't hype, it was math. For decades, the Japanese yen has been the backbone of the global carry trade. Investors borrow yen at near zero rates and deploy that capital into equities, bonds, real estate, and yes, crypto. Effectively, free leverage. As long as Japan keeps rates pinned, the system holds. But the moment rates rise meaningfully, not a symbolic 25 BPS, but 50, 75, something that actually hurts, that entire structure starts to unwind. And here's the part most people miss. Unwinds don't happen politely. They don't wait for good liquidity. They don't give you time to reposition. They cascade, often over weekends, often when markets are thin, often when participants are trapped. This is why phrases like Happy Monday matter in macro circles. Markets love to move when exits are narrow. Now pause here, because this is where crypto narratives usually collapse into fear. Retail assumes liquidity shock equals crypto down. And initially, they're usually right. Risk assets get sold first, everything correlations to one. But that's only phase one. Phase two is where things get uncomfortable and where opportunity hides. Because after forced liquidations finish, the system asks a very different question. How do we move value efficiently when stress exposes every inefficiency at once? And this is where XRP quietly enters the conversation. Not as a meme, not as hype, but as a utility problem solver. But don't rush ahead, we're not there yet. Moments of systemic stress don't create innovation, they reveal which innovations were already ready. When trillions of dollars are under pressure, institutions don't ask ideological questions. They ask practical ones. How fast can I move money? How cheaply? How safely? How much yield am I losing by letting capital sit idle? And this is where the legacy nostro vostro system becomes impossible to defend. Banks park trillions of dollars globally just so payments can function. That capital earns nothing, it just sits there, frozen. Now imagine that same capital earning even 1% yield, 24/7, while remaining instantly available. 1% on trillions is not a rounding error. 2 to 3% changes balance sheets. That's not speculation, that's arithmetic. Let that sink in. This is why Ripple has never marketed XRP as a retail fantasy. They've been quietly assembling infrastructure, liquidity relationships, regulatory engagement, banking licenses, institutional grade rails. This is not a bull market narrative. This is plumbing. And plumbing only becomes visible when pressure hits the pipes. We'll come back to Ripple's positioning, because the timing matters more than people realize. Now layer something else on top of this macro stress, regulation flipping from headwind to tailwind. For years, institutions stayed away because the rules were unclear. The SEC was hostile. Everything lived in gray zones. That era is ending. Stablecoin frameworks are being defined. Market structure clarity is forming. Harmonization between regulators is underway. These aren't exciting headlines for retail, but they are green lights for trillions. Institutions don't move on vibes. They move when lawyers say yes. And once that happens, capital doesn't trickle. It floods. This is also why tokenization keeps showing up in serious conversations. Not because it's trendy, because it collapses settlement times from days to seconds, because it reduces counterparty risk, because it frees trapped capital, and once part of the system moves on-chain, fragmentation becomes unacceptable. You can't have half the system running on legacy rails and half on tokenized rails forever. Eventually, one wins. History is very clear about this. Now here's the open loop most people aren't ready for yet. Tokenization without neutral, global liquidity hits a ceiling. Private blockchains alone don't solve that, which is why interoperability, not maximalism, wins, and why certain assets keep reappearing in institutional conversations, even when retail sentiment is bored, angry, or distracted. We'll connect that dot next, because this is where the missing puzzle piece starts to form. Stay with me. Now this is where most people completely lose the thread, because they hear institutional adoption and imagine headlines, press releases, executives smiling on stage. That's not how this actually happens. Real adoption shows up quietly in the plumbing of the financial system, long before price reacts. And this is where XRP's role becomes deeply misunderstood. Here's the key distinction smart money understands. XRP does not exist to make you rich. XRP exists to make the system efficient. And when efficiency becomes mandatory, not optional, price becomes a consequence. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about tokenization for a moment, because this is the bridge most people never cross mentally. Tokenization is not about putting things on blockchain for fun, it's about compressing time. Settlement today takes T+2, sometimes longer. During that time, capital is frozen. Risk exists everywhere. Now contrast that with atomic settlement, delivery versus payment happening simultaneously, instantly, with cryptographic finality. That's not a marginal improvement, that's a generational leap. And here's the part retail rarely connects. When settlement time collapses, capital is freed. Capital that was once held as a buffer can now be redeployed. That increases velocity. It increases yield. It increases balance sheet efficiency. This is why tokenized treasuries exploded first. Not because treasuries are exciting, but because they're massive, liquid, and already trusted. They were the easiest proof of concept. Stablecoins followed the same path. And think about this for a second. The largest tokenized asset on Earth isn't a stock or a bond, it's the US dollar. Tokenized dollars now move 24/7 globally without banking hours. Once institutions are comfortable with that, everything else follows. But here's the uncomfortable truth most narratives avoid. Private blockchains alone cannot scale this vision. They solve internal efficiency, yes, but they fail at global liquidity. You can tokenize assets inside walled gardens all day long, but without neutral, deep, always-on liquidity, you hit a wall. AAE. This is why public blockchains matter. They are the connective tissue. They are the liquidity layer between private systems. And this is why interoperability beats maximalism every single time. The future is not one chain to rule them all. The future is multiple systems, private and public, interconnected. And the assets that thrive are the ones designed to bridge those worlds compliantly, efficiently, and at scale. Let that sink in. This is the context in which XRP keeps reappearing, not as a meme, not as a cult asset, but as a neutral bridge, instant settlement, deep liquidity, regulatory engagement instead of avoidance. You don't have to believe every bullish projection to see that the design aligns with where the system is heading. And when regulation stops being an existential threat and starts becoming a framework, adoption accelerates. Because institutions don't move on vibes. They move when lawyers say yes. This brings us to regulation, the piece retail either ignores or misunderstands. For years, crypto lived in gray zones. The SEC was hostile. Rules were unclear. Institutions stayed away, not because they hated crypto, but because uncertainty is risk. That's changing. Stablecoin frameworks are forming. Market structure clarity is coming. Regulatory perimeters are being drawn. These are not retail headlines. These are green lights for trillions. And when those green lights turn on, capital doesn't trickle in. It reallocates, quietly at first, then all at once. This is also why the ETF conversation matters far more than people think. An ETF is not just a product, It's a distribution channel. It allows pensions, advisors, and institutions to gain exposure without touching wallets, keys, or exchanges. When demand flows through that channel, it's persistent. It doesn't panic sell. It doesn't chase candles. It doesn't react emotionally. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. There is not infinite XRP available at market prices. Circulating supply matters. Liquidity matters. OTC desks are not bottomless. Exchanges are not infinite pools. Ripple's escrow is not a vending machine. At some point, price has to do the work. This is not financial advice. It's market mechanics. Now start layering everything together. Macro pressure, carry trade stress, liquidity tightening, regulatory clarity arriving, tokenization accelerating, ETFs lining up, institutional infrastructure already built. This is not one catalyst. This is convergence, and convergence is what creates non-linear outcomes. That's why waking up on Monday to nothing happening feels frustrating, not because something must happen on a specific date, but because pressure has been building for years. Systems don't break when everyone expects them to. They break when complacency peaks. And zooming out even further, this is the philosophical shift most people will only recognize in hindsight. Value is moving on-chain. Settlement is going instant. Yield is becoming programmable. Liquidity is becoming global and continuous. Assets that enable that movement don't need hype. They need relevance. And relevance eventually shows up in price, but never when the crowd expects it. We're not at the beginning. We're not at the end. We're in the middle of the inflection point, where macro pressure, regulation, and technology finally align. This is the part of the cycle that feels boring, frustrating, and tense. And historically, this is where generational wealth is positioned, not created. We'll connect the final piece next, because once you see where capital is being forced to go when old pathways stop working, the picture becomes impossible to unsee. Stay with me. Now here's the missing puzzle piece, the one that ties everything together. Most people think liquidity disappears in moments like this. It doesn't. Liquidity relocates. And the biggest reallocations in financial history never announce themselves with fireworks. They move quietly, structurally, before price makes it obvious. This is where smart money separates from emotional money. When carry trades unwind, when global debt loads become suffocating, when settlement delays become intolerable. Capital doesn't ask if it should move. It asks where it is allowed to move efficiently. This is where understanding the plumbing of the financial system matters more than watching charts. Legacy rails were built for a slower world. Banking hours, geographic silos, days-long settlement, trapped capital. That model worked when money was cheap. It does not work when liquidity tightens. This is why tokenization isn't optional anymore. Once treasuries, funds, and real-world assets start living on-chain, fragmentation becomes a liability. You can't have tokenized assets on one side, legacy rails on the other, and expect trillions to move smoothly between them. Eventually, capital consolidates around the most efficient path. History is ruthless about this. More efficient systems always replace less efficient ones. Not overnight, but inevitably. Let that sink in. And this is where XRP's positioning becomes uncomfortable for skeptics. Not because of hype, not because of narratives, but because it sits exactly at the intersection institutions care about: neutral bridge asset, instant settlement, deep liquidity, regulatory engagement, designed for scale, not vibes. You don't need to believe XRP becomes the only asset. That's not the thesis. The thesis is that infrastructure assets get repriced when the system depends on them. And repricing doesn't happen gradually. It happens when demand becomes structural. This is also why comparing everything to Bitcoin misses the point. Bitcoin is digital gold, a store of value, a hedge. That role matters. But infrastructure assets play a different game. They're about throughput, settlement, connectivity. Bitcoin doesn't need to move value between banks. XRP does. Ethereum, Solana, Chainlink, these are rails, not vaults. Different tools, different jobs, same transition. Now zoom all the way out. By the end of this decade, it's very likely that blockchain rails are default. Tokenized assets feel normal. Moving millions globally in seconds feels boring. And when that happens, people will say it was obvious. But it never feels obvious while you're inside the transition. It feels confusing. It feels slow. It feels like nothing is happening. That's exactly where we are. This is not about picking a date. It's not about hoping for a Monday candle. It's not about reacting emotionally. It's about understanding where capital is being forced to go when old pathways stop working. Liquidity doesn't vanish, it reroutes, and the people who build generational wealth are the ones who positioned early, understood the infrastructure layer, and had the patience to sit through boredom and doubt. This is not financial advice. This is about connecting the dots. If this helped you see the bigger picture, subscribe to Lion of Crypto and turn on notifications. We're not here to chase hype. We're here to understand systems and position ahead of them. Because by the time price explains it, the opportunity is already gone.